I'm Caleb with You Can Make This Too. Thanks for joining us. Today I'm going to show you how we made this awesome LED backlit sign that Richard from 42 Fab cut out on his plasma cutter for me.
Yep, and when we're done with your sign, we're going to be working on mine. I cut one out too, and Caleb showed me the ropes with woodworking so we could make a background for it.
But anyway, stick with us and we'll show you how you can make this too.
Okay, so first up I want to disclaim that we weren't diligent with wearing our full PPE. Just on the time that it took us to do this quick project, I actually ended up with a pretty good sunburn on my left forearm. So as always, whenever you're working with tools, especially new ones, make sure you check the owner's manual for whatever PPE and safety equipments and steps you need to take. Now with that out of the way, what we've been doing is making some angle iron that's going to be basically the frame of this sign. I didn't plan ahead and get the size angle that we needed for this project ahead of time, so I just picked up some flat bar from the home center and we made the angle that we needed. Now a big thing I learned during this project is that metal moves. When working with wood, I take into account how and if it'll move through the seasons in the construction and design. For metal, I have to take into account how the heat from welding will affect the metal. Welding happens at a very high temperature, but then cools quite quickly. And as metal cools, it contracts with tens of thousands of psi force. So that has to be taken into account when fitting, setting up your welds, and welding the pieces together. After I ground my ugly weld smooth, there were still some fish hooks left from where I didn't get a good weld. So I came back with some spot welds to fill them in and then grinded them back again. After doing this a few times, we ended up with some pretty smooth, albeit warped, pieces of angle. The constraining dimension on this project was the width of the acrylic I could get, so we cut that down to size and then used the acrylic and just kind of by eye to miter the angles into the frame for the sign. We did this in a few steps, first cutting the long sides and then mocking things up to mark the length of the short sides. Richard did the cutting by eye with his angle grinder, and then we finessed the pieces as needed and cleaned up the cuts with a flap disc. One of the nice things about a metal project like this is you can always fill gaps with weld and then grind it back if needed, which can't always work like that with wood, which is how we made the miters fit. Since the angle has a bit of a bow to it, trying to find the perfect angle to get these to join up properly would have been a lot more challenging than just cutting generously and then filling the gaps. And since this project will just be ground and then painted, no one will be the wiser. When I welded the frame together, I welded in opposite corners to minimize building up too much heat in one piece at a time. I welded the inside corners first, and then I welded the face of the frame, and then gave things some time to cool before welding the outside corners. And for the miters that needed some gap filling, we just bounced from side to side of the gap until it closed and then filled it in. Then it was time for a lot of grinding. The face was ground flat, and then I ground each corner to a tight radius. I wanted this to have a wood backer, so I cut some scrap plywood to size and then put some oil-based poly on it to give it a nice tone. Once that dried, I transferred the bow of the frame to the plywood and then cut the plywood to fit on the bandsaw. I used this piece to also hold the battery pack for the LEDs we were putting in here, so I routed out a pocket for that to sit inside. Now it's time to start adding the acrylic, which is what my logo will sit on. I want this piece to have a lot of depth, so I start by making some standoffs for the main piece of acrylic. I cut the curve they need at the bandsaw and then epoxy them to the frame before epoxying the main piece to the standoffs. After the epoxy cures, I add the LEDs to the frame. I wish that I'd added something to diffuse the light at this point, but I didn't think about it then, so I may go back and do that later. Then we tap the plywood into place and secure the battery pack. We were in a bit of a time crunch on this project, so when we flipped it over, we realized that the paint hadn't had enough time to fully cure. So we carefully taped off all of the acrylic and added some more paint, then peeled off the tape, and we're just super careful not to touch the paint as we wrapped up. So the last step of this sign is adding my logo. Now Chad from Manecrafting was awesome and powder coated the pieces for me while Richard was visiting him during Richard's America tour. The logo pieces needed to have a bit of standoff from the acrylic, so we epoxied some number 6 nuts onto the back of all the pieces before laying them out on the acrylic. Once we had the layout where we wanted it, we started epoxying the pieces onto the acrylic. Okay, so actually the last thing to do is have a way to mount it. So off camera I added a French cleat to the back to make it easy to hang, and with that it's done. This project was an absolute blast. I had fun MIG welding for the first time and working with Richard. I hope you enjoyed it too. Thanks for watching.
Thanks for having me out here, man. Been a great time. You and Callie have been awesome on putting me up. Thanks again.